Our second speaker today is Michelle Boyd, who is a general paediatrician and it leads the inpatient eating disorder program at Queensland Children's Hospital and has developed a newfound passion for young people and eating disorders, which is great because many of us in this field for long periods of time feeling very burnt out, I have to say. So this might be really helpful for us.
Excellent. So thank you for having me today. The irony of this time slot is that you are primed for your postprandial hypoglycemic coma to kick in. So please bear with me because I am going to be talking about refeeding and particularly thinking about the early use of continuous nasogastric feeds. Just have a think about the context in which you work, where you intersect with these young people, because I'm going to pose a few questions and try and think about how that might relate to your workspace. So when you're dealing with these young people, and even last week, so they're not everyone's cup of tea, hey, and I was being given the death stare of my life by a young lady who looked at me dead in the eye and she said, "Your job sucks, you should get a better job." And here I am. Anyway, so when you've got young people in this environment and I'm considering what treatment do they need and how should we deliver it, you must ask the questions, particularly I'm going to talk about nasogastric feeding, is it ethical? Is it safe? And what does the evidence tell us about outcomes with different refeeding methods and how they're tolerated by young people? So let's think about the first question, and you should have an answer that you can formulate about, is it ethical to insist on nutrition and in what form to someone that doesn't want it? And that's my population. So to answer this and develop the protocols at my hospital, I've had to come up with a framework in how I like to provide my protocols and also think about delivering really compassionate and evidence-based care for my young people. And so my young people have a desperate fear of food or weight gain. They have no insight into their condition, and guess what? They can all get completely well if they have the right nutrition or the psychological care that they need. So my framework starts with thinking about the Hippocratic Oath. We all took it out of medical school of first do no harm. So in my opinion, watching or enabling someone to starve themselves in hospital, I think is akin to inflicting further harm. And I think that if treatment is available and safe, which is nutrition, it should be given. I then have a think about my young people and whether we're going to harm them by the treatment that we're giving. So I do take into account their diagnosed allergies, their gut conditions, and the cultural needs of that family. The third thing that I'm really careful about is that my team and I provide written and evidence-based information about what will happen to that young person if we allow themselves to starve themselves further to their medical or cognitive health. And then finally, I think that if nutrition is available and safe, it should be given right from the emergency department. So if I move on to the second point of what do we need to consider to think about safe delivery of care to young people who are starved? In the emergency department, you obviously will assess their level of hydration, their level of electrolyte disturbance, but I need you to consider things like their overall level of malnutrition and their risk of refeeding syndrome. Because we know that these young people can actually deteriorate with the treatments that we deliver in that emergency care setting. So you've got options in ED. You can give IV fluids, we can give oral food, or you can give oral liquid supplements, or you can consider nasogastric tube feeds. And I was just talking to Jenny at the beginning, some units in extreme circumstances might consider TPN or gastrostomy or jejunal feeds, which is not actually something that my unit does. But I'll give you a scenario if we first think about IV fluids. So a lot of you are emergency department physicians. So let's say your department is heaving, and you've got a kid that you think's only borderline for needing to come into hospital, their heart rate's 52, their postural change or postural tachycardia is 35 without symptoms, and their blood sugar's 3.5, and your boss says, whack him some IV fluids and get him out of here. The big problem that I've got with that statement is that this person is not just dehydrated. They're actually depleting glucose, protein and fat, and a whole range of micronutrients and minerals, zinc, selenium, B group vitamins, iron, and many more. And you actually can't make up their nutritional deficit with those short-term IV fluids. And the next thing you need to understand is someone who's chronically starved is actually not the same as your acutely sick and dehydrated person. So in that chronic phase of food restriction, which often comes with chronic fluid restriction, you actually turn on the renin-aldosterone system, so your body is designed to hang on to salt and water whenever you can get it. So you come into hospital, you put in some IV fluids, and these patients blow up. They gain weight, they get heavy. And in the adult space, we know that those adults actually will often refuse to come to emergency because of that really negative cycle. One other thing is if you're a chronic vomiter and you're chronically restricting, you can go into something called pseudo-Bartter syndrome. And so that's where you can actually go into a state of hypokalemic, hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis. So your treatment that you think you're making a patient better actually makes them worse. So for all you ED clinicians here, I implore you, please don't give IV fluid boluses unless it's life-threatening. If you think IV fluids are the best way to go, I'd give it at really slow rates, like probably less than maintenance. And certainly don't think that IV fluids are going to solve the problem because you haven't really considered nutritional need today or tomorrow or the next week. So that's my big bugbear about IV fluids. And just a little anecdotal story, I've got a young lady in right this moment who we didn't give IV fluids to. She's gained 7 kilos in 5 days. So I'm having a bit of a heart attack because she'd lost 30% of her body weight. So it's not quite refeeding syndrome, but I'm experiencing texts with my dietitian this morning over, and what we're going to do with this young lady. So let's think about oral feeds. So there's lots of pros of feeding orally. It's physiological, it's non-invasive, and you're meeting those goals of admission right from the beginning. You want them to eat orally by the end. But for me, clearly, there are lots of negatives. So the negatives are my patients will not eat. Or if they eat, they don't eat enough density and variety, which is going to lead to recovery. There's the risk of refeeding syndrome and all the electrolyte and blood sugar monitoring that we actually need when someone's not eating. And you've got to think about emergency care. So it's the middle of the night, we've got 15 eating disorder kids in, one's got a sugar of 1.8, they refuse to eat, and you've got limited staff to deal with that. So there's lots of difficulties. And also the gut finds it really hard to tolerate food when it's been restricted for a really long time. So some units have gone to oral liquid supplements. What does that mean? So Starship in New Zealand uses this strategy, and they give their kids milk-based feeds every 3 to 4 hours orally as their initial protocol. So again, non-invasive, physiological. But for me in my hospital, I think that's really tricky because if you're waking a teenager every 3 to 4 hours in the night to drink a milk-based feed, guess what? You've got the same issues of emergency care and sometimes tolerance issues, taste and texture and monotony and all that sort of stuff. So I'll move on to the guts of the talk, which is really talking about nasogastric feeding and why I've advocated for it in our hospital. And I think you really need to do it through understanding safety in refeeding and the refeeding syndrome. So for me, there was an amazing article published in 2011, and I think it was a world changer in terms of how we deliver feeds early to our kids in hospital. And it was actually done by the team at the Sydney Children's Hospital, led by Cohn, Madden and Clark. So it's an article about refeeding and anorexia by understanding protein-calorie malnutrition. And so in this article, they set out to look at all the current cases of refeeding syndrome in the literature. And lo and behold, refeeding syndrome was actually recorded at a whole range of calorie rates. So you might know that the refeeding protocols they developed in the 1970s in the ICU setting when we first learnt that refeeding syndrome was occurring in people that were recovering from catastrophic illness. And at the time, these start low, go slow protocols were devised that often started at as little as 600 kilocalories per day. We'll put 600 kilocalories on the eating disorder population and everyone loses weight in hospital. So they coined a new term called the underfeeding syndrome, which is actually hospital-based underfeeding. So Cohn team said, well, if you can still get refeeding syndrome and you're losing weight in hospital, surely this is not right. So they turned to the work of some physiologists named O'Connor and Golden. And I'm going to use my hands here because I explain this to my patients all the time. So they really articulately described the refeeding syndrome, and this is how I say it to my patients. So when you're starving yourself, you've got not enough energy coming in, so your body says, where is my energy source going to come from? I'm going to break down fats and muscle, that's called ketosis, and it actually keeps you alive, and those sugars are quite safe for your brain. So if low levels of glucose are coming in, the hormone that helps control glucose is called insulin, that's also low. So you come into hospital and we say, right, nutrition is what you need, and we give you a lovely big carbohydrate-based meal. Guess what? Our glucose shoots up, we flick over into glucose metabolism, and our insulin shoots up. And it's actually the surge of insulin that causes refeeding syndrome, because insulin's job is to wake up all our cells. And it does this by driving potassium, glucose, phosphate and fluids from our intravascular space into the cells. So you can imagine, unless your cells are getting continuous substrate, they run out of energy and we go into multi-organ failure. So it's cardiac failure, respiratory failure, kidney failure, or delirium and brain failure, and we die. So I kind of said, well, we actually can see that the refeeding syndrome can actually occur at any refeeding rate as long as there's enough glucose in that bolus of food coming in. So if you actually adjust how you deliver feeds, that is, you do it continuously to start with, you can actually avoid the refeeding syndrome but potentially challenge the rate that you start at. And they just adjusted their feeds by adding a bit of a fat emulsifier, so they gave equal parts glucose to fat. So the Cone team went, oh my God, this is the answer. Let's start refeeding at 2,400 kilocalories. Amazing difference. So obviously there are lots of pros, I think, about giving nasogastric feeds, because you can give a complete food source right from the beginning at an energy rate that avoids refeeding syndrome. Obviously, we actually can use less monitoring, so less BSL and electrolyte monitoring. It actually, in our hospital, we had less staff reviews required, like less dietetics consults required. But negatives, I think, obviously, is that it's very uncomfortable to have those tubes passed for our young people. Other negatives about what do you do in your department if it's constantly pulled out or vomited up. And you have to think very carefully about how you're going to transition to oral feeding, given that that's the goal throughout the admission. So, and I'm not going to talk about the gastrostomy feeds, but you can ask questions at the end. So then let's have a think about, right, if that's what we know about the science of refeeding, what does the literature tell us about outcomes? So there are a myriad of papers and systematic reviews looking at refeeding, and the outcome measures are fairly common amongst these papers. So we look at length of stay, we look at weight gain in hospital, readmission rates, rates of refeeding syndrome, and rates of recovery. And it is pretty clear in all of that literature that the outcomes by giving higher energy refeeding right from the beginning leads to much improved outcomes. So very clearly we have shorter length of stay, lower readmission rates, reduced rates of refeeding syndrome, higher weight gain in hospital, and most importantly, that Cone article that I've referenced really clearly linked, if you gain weight, good amounts of weight gain in that hospital admission, you are positively geared to have a better outcome at 12 months, in that you're more likely to be in recovery. So I think that was really clear, that what we do in hospital makes a difference. It's really important. So if we think about tolerance, there's very few articles that look just about the psychological aspects of tolerance for our young people. Those that do talk about negative aspects, like the young person doesn't feel in control. Clearly I've referenced the pain and discomfort of having the tube. But they also talk about the tube for some people is a visible symbol of their illness, and they've been trying to hide that for so long, and so they found that very difficult to deal with. They had to say to the world, hey, I've got a problem with my eating. But these same papers were very clear at saying that we as clinicians, right from the emergency department, if we go through a certain set of steps, we'll actually get it more tolerable, we'll get it right. And so those circumstances are that the nasogastric tube protocol is actually put in as part of a standardised medical plan, that the rationale for its use is described to the patients when they get in. And really importantly for all of you in ED, if you give the patient some sense of who they want in the room, which nostril they want the tube down, and they get an ability to say, hey, I need a breather or a drink of water when that tube's going down, you can make a difference and get the most experienced person in the room. I'm sorry, if you're a student learning, they're not your best patient to be putting your first NG down. So in all these papers, none of them say that refeeding via nasogastric tubes is safe or intolerable, but I think it'd be really nice to look at some work that looks at the attitudes of young people in acute starvation, so when they're first in hospital, and then go on and do those future studies at 12 months when they're recovered to see what, in hindsight, they think about. So I think in summary, I've got a very clear stance that I've given you that I think it's unethical to allow a person to further starve themselves in hospital when the treatment that we're wanting to provide is nutrition and that is safe and life-sustaining. The tube feeding is definitely safe. It's very safe that we can start those higher energy rates, and physiologically it's probably much better for a young person, and it's actually better for their gut because their gut just starts to wake up slowly. In my experience, it is quite well tolerated, and just to give you some feedback on an audit our hospital did, we looked at the outcome measures that I've talked about from a period of 9 months when the Children's Hospital first opened and we had an oral eating plan, and then we looked at the outcomes 6 months after we put in an NG protocol. And our length of stay reduced by 1 week, which is massive, particularly in current bed pressures. We had an average 2 kilos of weight gain more per patient, even in a shorter hospital admission. The other thing that stood out is that the time to physiological recovery, i.e. your heart rate came up above 50, your temperature rose, your electrolytes were stable, reduced by about 6 or 7 days of time to recovery down to about 1. We had no refeeding syndrome. Our staff found it much better because they were empowered to follow a protocol. And so for us, it was a no-brainer. This was working in our institution. So I think that in wherever you work, if you have an oral feeding protocol, I would be questioning and saying, how does it work for you guys? What goes well, what doesn't go well? In my institution, the tube goes down from the emergency department for the first couple of days, and then we transition over to eating in the day, tube feeds at night, and then over to eating orally, and that progression works well for us. So I think nasogastric tube feeding is really important because that early weight gain in hospital is crucial. In the current health burden and the crisis of beds, a reduced length of stay is really important. And so I support the fact that nasogastric feeding in my hospital is an ethical, safe and tolerable way to refeed. Thank you.
Over here and then over there.
Can you wave again? Sorry.
It was David, I think, first.
It'll be you, and then you.
And thanks, Michelle and David Meldrum from Lismore. And yeah, we've been doing NG feeding from the start for ages. But I'm just interested with what you're saying. So do you go straight to 2,400 kilocalories right at the start? Or
yeah, so we weren't as brave as Sydney Children's Hospital. We started at 2,000, and for me that was, there was a little bit of consternation amongst my paediatric colleagues of the rate of 100 mils an hour being standardised across a whole range of ages and weights, and so we chose the 80 mils an hour as slightly lesser volume, and then we probably then didn't need to overthink whether it was a 12-year-old versus a 16-year-old. So we're an 80 mils an hour at a 1 cal per mil feed. Yep, and that's worked, and I haven't actually felt the need to push that because we're getting really good outcomes with early weight gain, so we've left that for years.
And is that for 24 hours and then you escalate?
No, it's really variable. So like any hospital, we're not perfect. If you come in on a Friday afternoon, the chances are you'll still be on that feed on Monday morning, even though we have on-call dietetics. But realistically, if we're really bradycardic and we get lots of kids whose heart rates are in the 30s, we'll be looking for those kids' heart rates to come up well into the 40s before we switch to some oral feeding. So it may be 48 hours before that's achieved. And we also take into account the child and their level of resistance to oral feeding as well. So we work with them to say, right, we'd really like you to start feeds tomorrow, whether that be on day 2 or day 3. What meal would you like to start with? We often encourage a snack first so that they're not confronted with a large volume of food. Because our kids are eating, like if they're on anorexia boot camp, they're cycling between 0 and 500 calories for weeks on end. And we're talking about when we start getting them to eat the daytime portions, 1,800 kilocalories with an additional 1,000 at night. Not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Michelle. I was wondering, how do you test for refeeding in terms of what's the frequency of you do the blood test?
In our protocol, we're doing daily for the first 5 days, and then we'll typically drop back to second daily and then drop back from there depending on where they're at. And we've taken the approach of routine phosphate replacement, just makes it easier. I find I'm in an enormous hospital, and trying to get people to individually think about who should have phosphate or not's too hard, so it's been safe, and so we just do BD phosphate from the beginning.
I'll go back and then front. Okay.
Michelle, this is Gav. I'm from Central Victoria, one of the pediatricians. Look, just one thing I did want to ask you about patients who are extremely treatment resistant and patients who go back home, haven't eaten for a few days, come back, have these two or three hospital admissions in a period of say 3-4 months. Have you ever done a thing where you would put them in the hospital and only put a nasogastric for a meal and then take it out and then do it again for the next meal?
So there's an emerging group of children who are absolutely following this pathway, and we've done a deep dive into our hospital system to look at comorbidities and primary diagnoses. So there's an increasing cohort of children who do not have anorexia nervosa as their primary diagnosis. They will have trauma, personality vulnerabilities, developmental issues, and so we've got a young lady who's on her 15th hospital admission at the moment in the last 4 months, and so she doesn't eat at all at home, and we know she's health seeking into the mental health ward, so we are managing her with 2 days of nasogastric feeding with offering her oral food. We never stop offering oral food, and then she goes home. We're clearly all very worried about this young person. Her complex case reviews today with the mental health team. So we've got an increasing cohort of those young people in a big institution. Like in terms of how many kids we get, we had 160 admissions in the 2019 to 2020 year and 390 in the 2020 to 2021 year. So we at most had 18 families in at once in May last year with 45 families for the month. It's enormous. And so, readmissions are big.
Hi Michelle, Laura Stevens in Bathurst. I'm a general paediatrician and I've probably got some more ward-based questions, so I'm sorry, given that you targeted ED. And I'm really trying to narrow it down to which ones to ask you, but what adjuncts do you add on top of the nasogastric feeds, bear huggers, bed rest, things like that? And I know you said that you hadn't seen any refeeding syndrome since you'd started this protocol, and I've heard that it's actually incredibly low in the literature. So is that something that we should be focusing less on?
I'll do the second bit first. So refeeding syndrome with the catastrophic organ failure is low in the literature, but these fluid shifts that we're seeing. So I wonder, in my girl who's gained enormous weight in the last few days, had I not had her on prophylactic phosphate, would I have actually seen a dip? She's had a magnesium drop, so perhaps I can say that I've actually got one that's partly meeting refeeding criteria. I think we still need to be mindful of it. There was a catastrophic case at the Gold Coast a few years ago, so please don't forget it, but it's often something that's put back to us saying you over-report it. Adjuncts, we don't warm, but I know Sydney does. We do bed rest until heart rate is over 50 at night time, and then I will actively get the kids up and padding around the ward, because clearly anecdotally the more you lie them down, the longer their postural changes take, and those morning postural changes are often worse. So I try and get them up, or allow them, if they go to a garden space in a chair, they're allowed to walk around afterwards. And the other adjunct for very distressed children is medication. So just remember, we do use medication with mental health colleagues, and often that's very short-term olanzapine use for profound distress in hospital.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Michelle. That was very interesting, really amazing.